Welcome to another anthropology lecture. This time we'll be talking about economic anthropology, and I'll kind of be trying to condense a whole lot of economic theory into a single lecture, while also trying to apply it to the case of ancient Egypt. So let's go. Some of the big questions that we have to think about for economics and anthropology is, how do humans acquire resources? What are the rules their society has for getting things and stuff out of the world? Um, and how do they exchange them? And then why do those ways differ around the world? If we all have to eat and we all have to work and we all have to do things to acquire resources, what explains why that's done differently? And the rules for how it's done differ among societies. The other big questions we should look at in terms of economic anthropology is, how do we decide questions of ownership? Do I own my labor, or can my labor be taken by someone else in the case of enslavement in the early United States? Or in the case of ancient Egypt, with the expectation that people give labor in order for pharaonic projects to be completed. Can people own land? Can they own other resources like personal and private property? And then how do governments organize the distribution of these resources? How do governments set up systems so that the resources can be managed? The government gets what it wants, the people get what they want, and the relations between people are regulated or not regulated in some cases. These are all the big questions we're going to take a look at. We can't answer them all, but we can advance some thoughts, and away we go. So essentially, we have to start with a definition for economics because I can't assume that you guys have taken AP Econ or Econ, and we no longer teach Econ in the government class that we offer here. So we got to define economics. It's the production, the distribution, and the consumption of scarce resources. One of the fundamental rules of economics is that you can't have everything you want all the time. Resources are scarce, time's scarce, money's scarce, all the physical resources of the world are scarce, and you simply just cannot have it all, despite what all the people in your social media might be suggesting to you. So how do we decide what to produce, how much of it? How do we decide how to distribute it? Who gets access to it? How do you decide what to consume? What is valuable to you? What are you willing to put in energy and effort to get? Now, the study of this dates classically to the 18th and 19th centuries with people known as the classical economists. They're not a group of people organized by any stretch of the imagination, but they are in England, they're in France, they're in the United States, and they're all thinking about, these economic questions. And several of the ideas that they come up with are still very important to us today. One of the general assumptions of this group of people is that economies regulate themselves. Economies just do what they need to do. Famously, this was described as an invisible hand, that people go out and they produce, they distribute, and they consume, and it doesn't need to be coordinated. People just do it automatically. One of the other key assumptions is that people are rational. Classical economists are influenced by the Enlightenment, the 18th and 19th century movement sweeping Europe, that focused on rationality, in particular, rejection of superstition. And so a lot of the classical economics folks think that humans are rational, they'll do what's best for them, do what's good for them. Of course, we now have an entire field of economics that completely has rejected that and turned it on its head. It's known as behavioral economics, and it's influenced by psychology. And then one of the last ideas that classical economics gives us that we still address today is that central to what should be going on economically is competition. When competition happens, it's good for everybody, and government should not be involved in that process. There shouldn't be an attempt at coordinating the economy, because governments will inevitably muck that up. This is known in your other social studies classes as the idea of laissez-faire, to let it alone, leave it be. In the 19th century, there is another competing idea of economics that comes about called Marxism. And the Marxist way of thinking noted that economies are not so self-regulating. There's no real invisible hand. They're actually very visible hands. And those visible hands are around the necks of workers, because capitalism, by its definition, by its nature, exploits resources, and it exploits the labor of workers. And they do that not because they are rational and they are competing out there for good. It's because they utilize political power and they utilize ideology to reinforce the belief that capitalism is good and it is natural and it is the right way to organize an economy. So Marxism swept into the 19th century and pointed out a whole bunch of criticisms of the classical assumptions of economics. And it is still with us today in this central idea that economies are fundamentally full of antagonistic relationships. And the biggest is really between the workers, the proletariat, and the middle class capitalists, or the bourgeoisie. These relationships are not, by their nature, collaborative. That in fact, the bourgeoisie is always extending its power and its reach to try to make as much money as it possibly can. And if that means crushing the workers, well, so be it. So out of the 19th century, we get a whole bunch of thinking about economics. The 20th century evolves some of these ideas a little bit more, but many of them are reformulations of these 19th century thought processes. And I don't want to go into them now, but you might encounter them later if you take AP Econ, or you might have talked about some of them in some of your other classes. Like, for example, Keynesian economics would be something that you might have heard, say, in APUSH. That is Adam Smith, whose book, The Wealth of the Nations, came out in 1776, right at the American Revolution. And so he's kind of one of the fathers of classical economics. And then that guy is Karl Marx, who, along with Frederick Engels and other folks, elaborated on Marxist theory, which has changed, and it's a very, very, very much different field than it was then in terms of the ideas that have been contributed to it over time. One of the key issues in economics is the question of ownership. Societies have to decide what is owned, who can own, how do you transfer ownership from one person to another. I mean, we kind of have this sort of inbuilt into us psychologically from the beginning. If you've ever witnessed a child grab a toy and go, mine, even if it's actually not theirs, there's a very, very strong sense within us to possess things, to control things. Economically speaking, we can divide property into kind of three categories. Real property is just land built and the buildings built on the land, but essentially it's not movable. I mean, I guess you could pick up the dirt, move it, but that's not really the point. Personal property is movable, so clothes, furniture, anything that can be transferred from one location to another. And more recently, intellectual property. This is a comparatively recent development in human history, the idea that what I produce in my head belongs to me. So any inventions, any writings, novels, songs, things like that. Um, Not every society historically has believed in individual ownership of property. That is, there's no universal sort of acceptance of the idea that things that I have are definitely 100% mine and I can use them any way I see fit. Many societies in the human past have organized property communally. That is, it belongs to all of us in the community. They have determined rules about how it can be transferred. For example, it may be passed through the family. Even in English history and English legal traditions, these rules, as late as the late 18th century, were still in play in the United States. For example, in English law and brought into America was an idea that you could um, write into your will that your property could never be divided up and sold by your children, that it had to pass and remain undivided within your family. And that got challenged in the early United States. So even in America, the idea of individual ownership, mine, has not always been the norm. And it's not the norm around the world either. So we should not think about property in the American cultural sense of this belongs to me and I can do with it I want to. And even if we do believe in an ownership of property, real or intellectual or personal, there may be limits on what you can do with that. So there may be social limits to how you can use your property. And this is a pretty long-standing notion even in American law, in the idea of what's called a nuisance. So you can't use your property in a way that would hurt someone else, that would be a nuisance to someone else. And I'll tell you a great illustration of that in Bexley history. In early Bexley in the 20s and 30s, in southern Bexley, there was the town dump where people dump their trash. And that garbage dump is today where Ferndale is. So that ground under Ferndale is full of all kinds of chemicals, hazardous materials that are not like really, really overtly bad, but definitely you don't want to go like eating the dirt there. Not that you want to eat the dirt in particular. The owner of that property was a relative of Bexley's first mayor, and he was taking automobiles and burning them because he owned it. So he was burning trash in this dump. And his neighbors said, what you are doing is a nuisance. The smoke and the mess that it is producing from your property is not good for our property. So they took him to court. He argued, well, it's my property. I can do whatever I want to with it. But in fact, the court said, no, you cannot. You cannot use your property in a way that hurts other people. So keep in mind, property rules, property laws do vary across cultures and legal situations around the world. When you think about an economy, you have to think about how we're going to produce and distribute goods and services. Um, what economists talk about in terms of production are modes, and it's kind of a fancy word. You think modes of production. What does that even mean? It really just means what are the resources that go into the production of goods and services. So a mode could be something like land, which I could farm and produce actual produce. It could be labor, because labor produces materials. It could be the technology that I come up with to like assembly line mass produce. It can be animals. Those can be part of the mode of production, whose labor then provides energy for the making of goods. Marxists point out that the modes of production also include the social power behind land, labor, technology, animals. The social power of, say, capital in a money-based economy, where capital determines who can enter into the production of a good because you got the money to start it. How many of you have ever had a really great idea for something and you think, wow, gosh, if I only had the money, I could make a killing off of this idea? Well, if you don't have capital, you can't get out there and produce. Social power could come in the form of law, which decides who can do what with their property, who can do what with their labor or technology. And it can be political control as well. Who is in control of the government to decide how we can use these modes of production? Once we produce something, we've got to then decide how to distribute it. Most of the earliest societies, the egalitarian societies in the world, did a lot of their distribution on reciprocity. It's relatively equal in the society, so people just exchange goods, and they exchange goods on fairly equal terms. So everybody is roughly equal, and they're just saying, hey, I got eggs, do you want blah, blah, blah. There are societies, though, that are less egalitarian, where you will have redistribution of the goods by a centralized authority, a chief, some kind of government, the Egyptian king, the Egyptian state. And in redistributive economies, the central power decides who gets resources. A good modern example of this would be a communist society, where the central state decides how resources will be allocated. And in a society like the United States, we have a market form of distribution. A market tends to be seen in capitalist economies, where people have their money that they invest in doing things to make a product in order to make more money. They're always chasing that dollar. So the goal is, in these societies, people buy and sell in order to make money. And the way that the value of their products gets set is through supply and demand. If I've got a lot of this thing, well, it's not going to cost you a whole lot. If I have very little, if I have only one of it, then yeah, you're going to pay a pretty penny to get it. But that value also depends on the demand for it, because if nobody wants it, it has no value. So you don't get anything for it if people are actually not interested in buying it. So market economies focus a lot on value. They focus on money. They focus on profit. They focus on a system in which you are trying to make a buck, but also pay the least you can in order to get ahead if you can. So those kinds of societies, relationships are often dominated by money and the value that money sets for the exchange of goods. We have still reciprocity even in capitalist and market economies. I don't want you to think reciprocity only exists in egalitarian societies, because people can still exchange goods and services even in a market economy. For example, there's a kind of reciprocity known as generalized, where you give a gift without expectation of immediate return. Like, you may get a gift later, but you're giving that gift right now and not expecting somebody to give a gift back. A good example of that would be a birthday gift. So if I bring you a present, I'm not expecting you to immediately give me a present in return. Maybe next year you'll give me a present, but maybe not. I don't know. A balanced reciprocity is where there's an exchange of goods and services with the expectation that at some point an equivalent value will be returned. So I'm going to give, but at some point you're going to give back. A good example of this in my personal life is Miss Shadi and I often go out to dinner and spend time, you know, eating well at nice places when we can, when COVID's not a thing. And sometimes I pay, sometimes she pays, but we always sort of balance it out. We don't keep track. There's not like a spreadsheet or anything, but we, kind of like it all works out to be balanced. A good example in American culture, not that you'd be familiar with this because it's not legal for you to drink yet, would be buying drinks at a bar. Bar culture in the United States generally expects that if you buy drinks or buy shots, that people will also buy in return for you. Maybe that evening, somebody buys a round and the next person has the next round. Um, Sometimes people buy with the expectation of they're buying your time or your company for the evening. So I'll buy you a drink. Now sit and talk with me because I bought you this drink. So the idea in a balanced reciprocity is I have given something, I expect something back. Another kind of reciprocity is negative, where people are exchanging goods and services for the express purpose of trying to get an advantage over somebody else. So I think of bartering for lunch in elementary school, where you're trying to make the best trade possible because you know that you don't really want your lunch, but your best friend over there, mom packed him something really nice. So what can you do to get that really nice thing that you want so that you get the advantage in the end? So we can have reciprocity even in a market economy. And we can also have redistribution even within a market economy. Think about taxation, for example. The government of the United States redistributes our wealth through taxation. They redistribute it in the form of paying for schools, paying for roads, paying for our defense. So don't think that you can't have all three of these kinds of distribution just because the US is a capitalist economy. Um, we can have capitalist culture and a capitalist society and a capitalist economy, but you can also see reciprocity in that, and you can see redistributive elements within that as well. In the United States, primarily, we function in a market system where we have goods and services that are sold according to their supply and then the demand for them. And the medium we use to make that happen is money. Hey, must be the money. Money is just simply a medium of exchange that makes it easy to buy and sell goods. So I don't have to go, well, I've got 12 eggs and you've got 4 pounds of butter. How do we decide what the value of the eggs and the butter are? Well, we can just use money to make that decision. Money is pretty universal culturally in lots of different societies that have figured out it's an easy way to exchange goods. And essentially, money standardizes the exchange because people understand if I give you this money, it has a meaning, it's understood, it's well defined. This, this thing here, if this is money, well, it's worth X, Y, or Z, and it's always worth X, Y, or Z, and we know that in our culture. It's got to be durable. So money that doesn't last doesn't make very good money. Divisible, that's more modern because it was harder to divide money in the ancient world, though people did it. They literally chopped off pieces of coins. Not as easy to do, but it certainly was done. And portable. It's great for money to be able to be movable because you don't want a currency that is so enormous or so weighty that you need a dump truck to carry it around. Um, we can still exchange in market economies without money through barter. where people are exchanging what they think is an equivalent value of a good for something else, maybe even bartering a service. I'll come power wash your deck if you will come help me, you know, plant trees in my lawn. So there are ways to do exchange in market economies without using money. Certainly barter does happen. And there are a lot of informal economies in the United States where this occurs often. I don't know if any of you have ever been to flea markets, if you've ever bought things off street vendors in major cities, where the economic exchange is very much not regulated by the state. So this happens. If any of you have ever worked under the table for somebody and they've paid you, but they've not reported that on their taxes. So we can have all these things in a market economy. I don't want you to think that everything in market economies must be supply and demand and through the medium of currency. Another issue that economies have to deal with is the division of labor. How do you figure out who's going to do what work in your economy? And a lot of this has been done historically by age. Children get assigned certain kinds of jobs that are age appropriate jobs, like in the 19th century, working in a factory. 5-year-olds selling newspapers on the streets of New York. It actually did happen. You can divide labor up by gender and say that roles can be assorted by male, female. Family history, lots of people's last names come from the fact that their families were a particular kind of working group in their village. So if your last name is Butcher, it might be that your family in its history, you were the butchers of that town. And sometimes there was an expectation that if that was what your father was, that's what you were as well. Sometimes we also divide labor up by talent. And so in societies that value merit and ability, the division of labor may be based on your training, your experience, your ability, if you can show that you have an aptitude for doing a certain kind of work. I want to focus on gender because it's the one that's historically been probably the most controversial for us today. Because historically, women's work has been focused on gathering food, home maintenance, childcare, cooking. It's been very domestically oriented. So this idea that women belong in the home. And we've struggled explaining why this is the case. Is it biology? Some people would like to believe that it is. Some people believe that it's a learned association that our ancestors just did, and then we've sort of gotten trapped in this process. Men's work has historically been hunting, cultivation, politics, and war. And one of the explanations for that has been sexual dimorphism, the idea that most species have differences in male and female bodies. And for humans, men tend to be larger and stronger. So me big man, me do politics, me also lead in war. That sort of like idea of our ancestors thinking this is what men should do because they're bigger. But does sexual dimorphism actually explain the gender division of labor, or was this something our ancestors came up with? Was it an accident of biology? Because biology doesn't necessarily mean destiny for humans. That's a fallacy, a logical fallacy. We shouldn't assume that nature sets conditions and therefore human decisions are just prisoners of the biology of nature. Because in many ways, we transcend our biology. Another way to think about a division of labor is through the French sociologist Emile Durkheim. Durkheim lived in the 19th century into the 20th century, and he said that you could divide societies up according to the nature of people's relationships with each other. Um, so for a pre-modern society like ancient Egypt, most people are homogeneous. They're very similar culturally, they're very similar in their lifestyles, in their thought processes. Their society is so homogeneous, we actually see less specialization of labor. There are relatively few jobs. Now, I would wonder if Egypt would fit into that, considering that we've looked at the number of positions that people listed on their old kingdom tombs. I am the manicurist to the king. I am the king's chief hairdresser. I am the king's, gossip confidant. So it might be that Durkheim might be a little bit mistaken about pre-modern societies. Um, But he also said that modern capitalist societies are more interdependent because the specialization is so strong that people need to depend on each other to do the jobs for the society to function. So I have a job, I must do it, and I need you guys to do your job so that I can do my job. The terms that Durkheim came up for these things were mechanical solidarity versus organic solidarity. Mechanic is the pre-modern societies. People are very similar. They're not as interdependent, and so there's less division of labor. Organic is we're all interdependent. I got a job. I got to do my job. You got to do your job because we all need each other to do our jobs. And so there's a more complicated division of labor. A lot of this has been challenged in recent years and it's been reformulated to think about it differently than the way Durkheim proposed. But I wanted you to be aware of Durkheim because if you go on to study the social sciences, you'll encounter Emile again. So where does this land for us in ancient Egypt? Um, what can we say about the Egyptian economy in terms of what we've talked about? We definitely know that the Egyptians engaged in trade. We've already mentioned that before. They utilized both peaceful trade, so we will go down and trade and get stuff from you in the land of Punt um, or Yam or wherever it happens to be, ancient Israel, the Sinai. We will acquire valued goods through war and conflict if we have to. So we will set up forts in southern Egypt and make sure we maintain the borders and maintain control over gold supplies. A similar modern phenomenon would be modern capitalist nations flexing their muscle to force weaker nations into favorable trade deals. So you weaker nation, I know you kind of need me as a more capitalist strong nation, so I'm gonna go in and pressure you to give me what I want because I know you need what I've got. We know the Egyptian state engaged in redistribution because we've already talked about that goods were acquired and produced for the king and the gods on estates that had land set aside to maintain the chapels erected for the worship of the king's Ka. We know that the temples themselves acquired lots of produce as well. They had their own land set aside for production. And we know that this was done as well to feed workers. So the state acquired goods in order to make sure that workers building pyramids were fed and taken care of. The Egyptian economy did not have money. It's very late that the Egyptians acquire money. It's when they do, it's called the deben. So their exchange would not have depended on a medium of exchange for monetary value. Instead, they would have talked about the quality of the linen. They would have talked about, the quantity of the beer, those sorts of things. We know that there is a division of labor, and the Egyptians have a far more complicated system of division of labor than at least Durkheim would have probably predicted had he thought about them. ranging all the way from the specialization in crafts, workers producing goods for the king's tomb, and all the knowledge is involved in the production of those goods. Um, we've got, of course, people in military control. We've got the governance of the nomes under the nomarchs. We've got people serving the king directly who left behind all the records on their tombs saying, I was the king's manicurist. That's quite a bit of division of labor. And of course, it's all wrapped up too in religious service to the king, the God on earth. So it's not just a job in the sense of we have a job today. It's a job that has a spiritual and religious significance because you are upholding the order of the state, ma'at. But we also know that there's personal property and real estate that people transfer. We see lawsuits in late Egypt, people talking about the division of estates. We know early Egypt, people are taking their goods with them way back. Aquata 1, 2, 3, even before, people are being buried with personal property, cosmetic implements, pottery. We know that people expect their families to use their resources to maintain the tombs of their ancestors. So these tomb chapels can receive sacrifices to please the spirit of the departed. And we have all kinds of evidence to suggest that people are utilizing the legal system to maintain control over property and make sure that it's being used in the way it should be. And even women find their voices in these systems as well. So I think Egypt presents to us kind of like a fascinating case. It's got some of those modern elements that we've looked at, but at the same time, it is still very much a redistributive economy with the king at the center. But on a day-to-day basis, ordinary people are doing the things they need to do in order to survive and to live. And what they're doing, the king doesn't necessarily need to know about until it's time to pay the tax man or time to give your labor to build the next pyramid. That's been it for our introduction to economics. We'll see you next time. We'll look at working man's life in pyramid towns, and we'll also talk a little bit about bread and beer.